Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, discussing Palamism and Thomism with Dominican priest and father Peter Totleben, along with Erick, a Roman Catholic. Father, it's great to have you on the show. How are you?
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm doing fine.
I really appreciated your dissertation that you wrote. It was excellent. And I want to say somebody took the text from your dissertation dealing with Thomism and Palamism and whether or not they can be integrated or whether or not they're compatible. They took the paper and somehow they had it communicated into audio format and posted on YouTube. So I've been sharing those YouTube links with other people.
I saw those links. Yeah, people put it up to me. And I just thought, well, if that's what you listen to when you're at the gym, to each his own, right?
Exactly. It might not be everybody's cup of tea, but I found it extremely fascinating. I loved it. I read the actual thing and made all kinds of notes, but I also like having audio available. So.
Oh, yeah.
So let's dive in. But actually, let me introduce you for anybody who's watching or listening who's not familiar with you. Father Peter Totleben is a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph and faculty member to the theology of the Josephinian Pontifical College in Columbus, Ohio. Father Totleben was ordained to the priesthood in 2016 by Bishop Campbell of Columbus. Is there anything in there that needs to be updated? Did I get you right?
Yeah, more or less. Right now, I teach the college seminarians at the Josephinum, but we're right in Columbus, and it's been great. So,
what are you teaching right now?
I teach the undergraduate theology classes there. For guys who are just coming in. It's exciting work. One of the cool things about it is there's a lot of interpersonal relationships. Mm-hmm. So I think it's cool because it's a really kind of pastoral and interpersonal type of teaching. And it's been a tremendous blessing in my life.
I don't imagine y'all get into Palamism and Thomism a lot, though. Is that,
I appreciate the opportunity to geek out a little bit by talking about some of this stuff.
Now, what made you interested in doing this paper? And, I'm also going to pull it up here just for anybody who's interested. It's called The Palamite Controversy, a Thomistic Analysis. Now, what made you decide to write on the issue of Palamism? Some would say this is just such an obscure topic. Why even write on it?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It came at sort of the intersection of sort of two interests that I have. First, I've just always enjoyed very much the Christian East. So I'm not a Palamite. I think I made clear that I'm not really a Palamite, but I very much enjoy and have been affected by the liturgy and the theology of the Christian East. I started attending, Byzantine Rite liturgies in the Catholic Church when I was in college. I attended a number of Orthodox liturgies. So Eastern spiritual writings have been very influential and interesting to me. So I've been kind of interested in the topic from that angle. Mm-hmm. And then there's also an interest that I have just in philosophical theology. So it's something that caught my mind, and I like thinking about. And then it came as an intersection. The specific question that really got me was that really was the proximate germination of this thesis was the seminar class that I took when I was in seminary. We needed to write a seminar paper. And the question came up about God's simplicity and God's freedom. So, like divine simplicity means God's being and God's activity or his willing are identical. Therefore, if God willed something different, would he be different? And I couldn't answer the question. And it drove me crazy. And then I asked my professor, and he kind of said, I don't know. And then I asked someone else, and they said in a fancier way, I don't know.
Right.
And then so I started, I was like, well, I want to know. And then I started reading what some older Thomists said about the problem. And it's funny, if you go back to the older Thomists who are writing in the 16th century around then, and when they start talking about some of these problems, they get to this question and they say to the effect, this is, by all accounts, the most difficult question in all theology, and the greatest doctors and geniuses all insist that no adequate answer for it can be found this side of heaven. And they say things like this, and this is not the sort of thing that you want to find out when you're just trying to get a seminar paper done. Right. But that's not the first thing you want to read, but it's what I read, and then it ended up turning into a thesis.
And that was for your licentiate?
Yeah.
Yeah. I really commend you for picking that topic. It's one of the most difficult that I've ever encountered when it comes to theological issues. It's not something that is addressed a whole lot, but it really needs to be addressed more. It really is something that both East and West tend to be unfamiliar with. Now, of course, the East is going to be a little bit more familiar with the Palamist view, but as far as the ecumenical dialogue on this topic, it's very much untouched for the most part. Now, I've had other individuals on from all perspectives. From a Thomist perspective, we've had Dr. Jared Goff from a Scotus perspective. We've had Dr. David Bradshaw from a Palamite perspective, and others. So we've had other people on, engaging in this dialogue, and so there's individuals out there. But it just seems to be that for the vast majority of cases, the ecumenical dialogue focuses on the papacy, and perhaps rightly so. But it seems like this issue needs to be addressed further. Now, from what I gather in your thesis, especially in the beginning, you note kind of the direction that you're going to be going in the paper, and you essentially say that this is not a church dividing issue. The differences between Thomism and Palamism when it comes to the simplicity of God, and this distinction between the essence and energies, and absolute divine simplicity on the other hand, that they are not dogmatic in difference. So it's not, it does not rise to the level of dogmatic differences. You do conclude that they are incompatible. You would say that there's no way to integrate them. However, it's on a lower level, and perhaps adiaphora, I don't know if you would want to categorize it that way, but on a level that's not dogmatic, we can agree to disagree on this. Is that accurate?
More or less, yeah. The way I think about it is, so first of all, I don't think that the dogmatic differences are substantive. There's some verbal differences between some dogmatic formulations in the West and some dogmatic formulations in the East. However, I think that when you sort of clarify the terms, you can sort of see that those dogmatic differences are verbal rather than real. I also think that both of the doctrines, both of the approaches, share the same fundamental convictions, right? They both share the same fundamental convictions about synergy, about deification, about apophatic spirituality, about how God can be radically other but also radically present, and how those things aren't different, but they condition and depend on each other. So I think both traditions have a strong orientation towards mystical prayer. So I think that they have the same fundamental convictions and deep down a lot of the same affirmations that are true from a doctrinal perspective. Where they differ is the philosophical explanation. So a Palamite is going to differ from a Thomist in philosophically giving like the metaphysical mechanics of how deification works, or what the vision of God is like in the afterlife, or the mechanics of the creation, or the relation of the divine ideas to the divine essence. So they're going to give a different explanation of how those are true, rather than sort of denying the sort of dogmatic matters of Christian confession, which they both hold in common. It's a bit like the difference between, say, a Thomist and a Scotist, right? So Thomists and Scotists are both Catholic, but they have different ways, they take different philosophical options, and those different philosophical options cause them to explain how the faith works in different ways. So they're agreeing on the same doctrinal points, but explaining them differently because they have different philosophical options.
Now, I'm glad and that makes sense. And I'm glad you brought up Scotism here, because That was going to be one of the questions that I ask you about. What do you think about the formal distinction of the Scotus? Because what they want to say is the formal distinction is a bridge between Palamism and Thomism, and individuals like Father Capes. I don't know if you've read
Yeah.
any of his papers, but he's going to say, Gennadius Galerius, the Patriarch of Constantinople,
Sure.
back when there was a lot of dialogue on this issue was going on, he was appealing to Scotism and saying, look, this formal distinction kind of bridges the gap here when it comes to the distinction between essence and energies and the simplicity of God as understood by Thomists. And then others like Dr. Mark Spencer, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's going to be on the show soon. And what he was saying is that the formal distinction is a way to it can be integrated into Thomism, and as long as we just reform Thomism with adding the formal distinction, Thomism can be rehabilitated in such a way that it can be, it can be integrated with the Eastern tradition. So there would be some who would say that it can be integrated. So would you agree with that, or would you take issue with it? And if so, why?
Sure. I would say that just with the issue between Thomas and Scotus, obviously I've never seen what the specific proposal would be. It seems to me that the question of the formal distinction, though, was one of the classic philosophical debates between Thomists and Scotists. And I think it actually comes from a diverse epistemology that the two schools kind of hold. So I'm wondering if it would be possible, but like, again, you'd have to see what the constructive proposal is. To me, it seems like that option is not possible. But then again, you'd have to, in order to definitively say what I would actually think, you'd have to see what the proposal on the table actually is.
Sure.
It seems to me that proposing distinctions prior to them being made in the mind is just kind of a line in the sand, like a demarcating line in the sand between the two schools. But that's not to say that someone's not creative enough to figure something out.
Right. And I think it would be interesting. What I intend to do is have Dr. Goff and Dr. Bradshaw representing the Palamite perspective, Dr. Goff representing the Scotus perspective, and also a Thomist representing, of course, the Thomist perspective, and maybe interact on these issues and see if we can perhaps get to the bottom of it, perhaps in a roundtable discussion. Because I think that this would be a fascinating topic to explore, because I think that there might be something promising here. There might be a way to integrate the two. Now, I'm not astute enough in the topic to tell you for sure definitively if that's the case, but I do see some promising work with Dr. Mark Spencer on the topic. I think that there might be some solutions there, but then again, I would need a Thomist and a Scotus to come on and maybe discuss it further. But I'm just throwing it out there because I noticed in the paper, as you indicated, that you thought that they couldn't be integrated. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that. I was reading Dr. Fazer not too long ago, and he was indicating that the Thomists can't use the formal distinction because he wants to say that the formal distinction is based on a paradigm that adopts univocity rather than analogy.
Sure.
And that might be true to a certain extent, but I don't know if it's so intimately bound, the formal distinction, if it's so intimately bound with univocity that it couldn't be integrated into it. And so hopefully that's something we could explore further. Now, you had also talked about other issues, because we know this distinction between the essence and energies, it leads into all kinds of other things when it comes to, for example, deification. Some in the East would say there's a big difference between the Western perspective of deification and Beatitude and the Eastern perspective. Would you agree with that? And if so, could you maybe lay out what those differences are?
This is the thing. Again, like, I think that the Thomistic explanation is more satisfying in my view, but I just don't see it. One thing I would suggest is sometimes it seems like you need a divine energy to account for deification, but it's never clear to me like what role in a like a synergistic account of divine human action, like what role the divine energy is playing exactly. Like, does the divine energy sort of, are you deified in the sense that the divine energy sort of replaces the human energy? What is the relationship between the divine and the human in the account of deification? Palamites typically find the Thomistic account of sanctifying grace as a created accident to make it sound like to make it sound like how could something created deify? And this
exactly.
is a created accident is different from God, and so it keeps you independent and autonomous from God, and it's created, so how could it deify? I think one way you'd want to distinguish that, like for Thomists, what they're going to say is that it's only in a qualified sense that an accident is really created. It's not a creature. Saying created is just a way of saying that's not co-eternal with God. Right. So what a Thomist is going to want to say is that what's actually happening is that what can be conceived of as a divine energy is operating on the creature, elevating that creature's being, right? So there's what's actually happening in the process of deification is that sanctifying grace, which is a real modification of the creature. That's what makes the creature be deified. The creature is and then is deified because he receives a real modification. But that modification isn't done independently of God's activity. God is sort of continuously energizing, if you will, the creature. And it's because God is continuously energizing the creature that the creature is deified. So it would be a bit like a signet ring and wax, right? The uncreated grace of the Spirit would almost be like the impress of the ring on the wax, and then the sanctifying grace would be the imprint, the imprint of the signet in the wax. The only difference being is that the imprint would only exist as long as the ring was being impressed, right? Or like an iron in the fire, when you put the iron in the fire, the glowing of the iron is really a property of the iron, but it only exists in as much as the fire is energizing the iron to produce that glow. So they wouldn't want to see deification as, so Thomists don't think of deification at all as being independent from God. Thomists would also not only emphasize the as in the Thomist account of deification, there's not only the uncreated action of God producing an elevation of the creature, you're producing a supernatural, created but supernatural energy of the creature. There's also the additional ideas of the theological virtues. So as deification works its way into our operative powers, making them capable of God in a supernatural way, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So like if you want to represent the full account of deification, you have to have all of those, as well as the Trinitarian indwelling and actual grace and all of that. So all of that goes into the Thomist account, and it makes it's an account that's radically synergistic. It makes it dependent on God.
Now, yeah, and you're careful to note here that actual that the grace the individual receives in deification from the Thomistic perspective is not actually created. We speak about created grace, but you were careful to note that what we receive is truly God, correct?
Well, it's not a creature, right? So yeah. So what it is it's a modification of the essence of the creature's soul. That gives it a supernatural participation. Now that's mysterious, but of course, I mean, it should be a little bit mysterious if it's supernatural. But we would say that created grace, so to speak, is it's not a creature, but it's not eternal and like sort of necessarily existing in a part of the divine essence. It's really distinct from the divine essence, not co-eternal with God, and a contingent product of his will. So it's created in that sense, but it's not created in the sense that it's a creature that sort of exists independently from God.
So how would you address, I'm sorry. How would you then address that, the objection that the Palamite might throw out there and say, okay, well, to me, it sounds like you're not really receiving God. You're not receiving something creative, but you're also not receiving God Himself. How would you address that?
Well, I would say you are actually receiving God Himself, because God Himself is acting on you. The difference in the explanation is both the Thomist and the Palamite can conceive of God's energy acting on you to make you, to give you a supernatural participation in God's life. What the real difference is that the Thomist is going to say, like, when you're thinking of God acting on you, what you're thinking of is the divine essence performing its activities, and you're just sort of thinking of them. It's a mode of thinking about the divine essence as if it is acting on you. So a Thomist is just going to simply hold that, what the reason why it's real deification is because God really is acting on you, and that God really is drawing you into Himself and giving you a supernatural participation, right? That quality of your soul, is really there because it's supernatural, and that quality of your soul is ultimately ordered to the reproduction of the divine persons in your soul, right? Right, because like the sanctifying grace qualifies the essence of your soul. Your soul needs to have its essence qualified in this sort of supernatural way, because what needs to happen is that the powers of your operations are given a new principle. So through the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, what actually happens is that your mind and your heart become capable of God. And because they become capable of God, what is known or loved exists in the knower and the lover, the divine persons actually come to dwell in your soul in this sort of intentional way. So Thomistic deification happens with God directly elevating you to give you a new kind of participation, and it ends with the divine persons actually coming to literally dwell in your soul. It's not clear to me on the Palamite account, and this is just something that's just been unclear to me, is how a particular divine energy, when it's sort of given to the creature, becomes properly the creature's, so that you can say that it is the creature that is deified.
Okay, and so that,
or how if a creature goes from being not deified to deified, that's a temporal change. So if an energy is uncreated, but comes to be and passes away in time, so that it can really be the creatures, how can it also be uncreated?
Okay.
It seems to me either has to be uncreated or not the creatures.
And, that would be an example of one of the questions you would have for the Palamite. And I guess let me ask one more question before we get to Erick and some of his questions, because we got him in the background here on audio. I guess let me ask this: what would be the biggest difficulty that you have with Palamism?
What I would say I wouldn't say like a difficulty in the sense of like a kind of contentious difficulty. I would just say that, like, in the way of thinking about God, what it actually does, ironically enough, is it makes God too much like a created agent, right? So the model of divine essence and energies actually conceives of God like God's actions in the world are transient actions that are performed in a way that's much too close to the way that a created agent performs actions, and the way that a created agent acts on already existing things in order to bring about changes in them. Even Palamas will concede that God is simple, for instance, but he'll say it's the kind of simplicity that's compatible with distinction, just like a soul is simple, but yet there's a distinction between the soul and its powers. So he's thinking about a God who acts out in the world and his activities are specified. This is also true on the side of Palamism that deals with the vision of God, where almost some passages of Palamas make it sound like the vision of God sort of terminates in a comprehensive vision of an energy itself, which actually turns out to be not apophatic enough. So I would say that absolute divine simplicity makes Thomism more apophatic than Palamism, which sees God more like after the model of a created agent.
Now, Dr. Mark Spencer, again, I mentioned he's going to be on the show soon, but I was interacting with him and he was noting a distinction with me in a message. He was addressing a distinction between God's intentional or experiential level and his ontological level. So he's basically saying that God does not change on his ontological level. He's pure act. He can't take on any kind of perfection or anything like that. But he can change only in the sense that he can have new experiences with creatures on his intentional or experiential level. Now, he's still maintaining simplicity, but he would make this distinction. And he's, of course, coming from a Thomistic perspective. So what would you say about that? Would you say that this distinction that he's making here, would you say that's just incompatible with simplicity, that there's no way that God's experience can be distinct from who he is, since God is simple? Or would you say that there is a distinction between God's experience and who he is?
Well, I would say that and this is just a knee-jerk reaction, so I'd have to think about it a little bit more. So I don't want to, it's not a hill I'm going to die on.
Right.
But I would sort of question sort of the fundamental distinction between the ontological and the experiential level of God, particularly if you were to say something like God has new experiences of creatures. I believe that was the formulation.
And I might be misrepresenting it. I might not be articulating it very well.
But like I wonder if distinguishing between the ontological and the experiential level of God is sort of a valid thing. What would it mean to say that God has an experience with creatures? Because it seems to me that the way that God knows and loves creatures isn't by sort of learning about them.
Of course.
God knows and loves creatures in as much as he's the cause of them, right? So it seems to me like the word, now it would depend on how you define this distinction, right? And what precisely Dr. Spencer means by experiential level. But just the way the term strikes me, experiential seems to me to connote a kind of passivity in God. So even if God isn't changing in time, his whatever the experiential level is, it's somehow affected by creatures. But God doesn't sort of know creatures by being affected by them. God knows creatures by causing them in the process of him knowing and loving himself.
Well, let me maybe read a brief excerpt on this distinction, just so I'm not putting words into his mouth, and let's see if this maybe helps clarify it. And again, he'll be on, and I'll have him expound on it further. But let me just read. He says, "I distinguish between what I call the ontological level within a being and the intentional level within a being. What I call the ontological level within a being is that being considered in terms of potency and act. Since God is pure act, his being cannot be added to or taken away. That is, he cannot increase or decrease in actuality, or in other words, in perfection. What I call the intentional or experiential level within a being is that being's experience or object directedness. I contend that it is possible for a being to have a new experience without that new experience needing to be explained by positing a new ontological actuality in the being, i.e. a new accident. We only need to posit an ontological change in a being to explain an experience or object-directed act of that being when that experience or act involves an increase in that being's perfection or actuality. For example, when I learn something new, this involves my receiving a new intelligible species into my intellect. That experience involves an increase in my perfection. But when I grasp that some being is present to me and I already have a fully adequate species of that being in my intellect, what later scholastics call an act of intuitive cognition, I have a distinct experience of that being without that experience involving my taking on a new perfection, actuality, or accident. And he goes on, but I think that's the distinction he's making here, is that, with this intentional or experiential distinction, it's not that the individual is taking on a new perfection. So
Sure. Sorry. I would just distinguish. He's saying that if I'm interpreting all of this correctly, it's a little bit dense to take in one reading. But if I'm interpreting this correctly, what it seems like he's saying is that this experiential level, God's not going to take on new experiences in time. And so he's being very careful to preserve the changelessness, the immutability, and the eternity of God, right? But which is fine. But all of the acts of creation can still be eternal, even though they're kind of temporally denominated. But just because God doesn't change in time, because God's outside of time, it still sounds like that's not sufficient to save him from the charge that God's being is affected by the creature from all eternity. Like God, rather than having successive experiences of the creature, God still has experiences of the creature just all in one shot at the beginning, or not really the beginning, but in his eternity. So it still sounds like there's a kind of passivity in God, and it seems like maybe the remote problem with this is sort of the way he sets up the problem of distinguishing between the ontological and the experiential level in a being. It seems to me like that's a perfectly valid distinction for like a person, right? I mean, we have a sort of experiential level whereby we gain new intentionalities in time. The real question is, can you make such a distinction? Are God's ideas and intentions really distinct from his essence, which of course is what the doctrine of divine simplicity precisely denies in the name of making God less like creatures. Right.
Okay.
So he sort of begins by distinguishing it on the level of a being of ordinary experience, and then going back and supposing that distinction exists in God. But it seems to me that the whole point of the doctrine of divine simplicity is that we have to, when we think about God, criticize our notions of creaturely perfections, and then that God is something sort of ever greater. That would be my intuition, but
yeah, and I'll ask him further about that. I appreciate that response, and let me ask one brief question, then have Erick come on here. Can't we say that there is some level of potency to God? I think Erick, that might be in the background. Are you there, Erick? Okay, I think he's muted. Is there a sense in which we can speak about potency in God when we distinguish between active potency and passive potency? Could you explain that distinction?
Well, I would say that we can distinguish, but we distinguish on our side, right? So we talk about God's will. God's will is a potency, right? God's intellect is a potency, right? Because your intellect is a power, right? Which is actualized when you actually think about something. Your will is a power which is moved to act when it actually thinks about something. So we actually have to signify potencies in God, and we actually have to think about God as powerful. The question isn't whether we think about God as powerful. The question is what in reality is answering to the concepts that we form. What part of what the doctrine of divine simplicity sort of says is that we have these sort of like refractory concepts, and we're forced to. Divine simplicity says that God is so ontologically rich that we can't think of him, and we're sort of forced to think of him in these refractory ways. But just because we think of him in these refractory ways doesn't necessarily mean that's how he exists. So we think of God as having having a will which loves, but really there's just an act of love. And what we call will and God's act of love are conceptualized in reality, are just identical to the divine essence.
Okay. Erick, are you there? Are you
Yes, I'm here. Yep.
Yeah, okay. Well, go ahead and jump in here. I know I've hogged Father here, so
no,
jump in with your questions.
Yeah, no, you're asking some of the things that are coming out of my own mind. So
yeah,
we're on the same track here. So
take it away.
Father, thank you so much for expressing those answers to these questions. These are not easy. One of the things that you had mentioned there, and I really concur with, because in my own studies of Gregory Palamas and some of the secondary literature that's been translated into the English or has been written in English, has left me with the same question as to what the divine energies really do accomplish for the Palamite position, that can be explained adequately. And reading Orthodox theology on this, going back to some of the work that was done in the 70s, there was an ecumenical meeting that took place. I believe it was in New York, and there was Anglicans and Catholics and Orthodox there. One of them being Father John Meyendorff.
Sure.
And they were trying to figure out what is the difference here between the Catholics and the Orthodox when it comes to this issue of grace and salvation. And one of the summaries that I read, because they put the acts and the minutes into text form, is that the Orthodox are trying to answer how does God become participable?
Yes.
How does God become something that we can experience in an intimate and experiential way?
Sure.
Whereas for the Catholics, the scholastics in particular, the question is, what happens to man in order that he can experience God?
Sure.
And so coming at it from those they're two different vantage points.
Yeah.
And the emphasis in our literature exemplifies that, because when we look at the issue of created grace, sanctifying grace, we're talking about modifications to human nature and the boosting up of his powers, and then in terms of the Eastern side, it's not so much what's modified in man per se, even though that's undoubtedly there, but more so on God being separable into the essence and then these infinite energies.
Sure.
And that's, this is where I see there's commonality, because we're both trying to answer, how does creator and creature come to be one in an experiential relationship? However, our vantage points being different, that's where we get clogged a bit in trying to understand this. And one point you made, which I think really gets to the heart of this issue, is that the Orthodox say, here's God's essence, which is beyond, beyond being. It's incomprehensible. It's no man can see that and experience that. How in a one-to-one manner, because it's just beyond being. However, God also breaks through into the creation framework, into the time, space, motion framework, in the mode of energies, and then comes to be in the creature. But what I feel is missed there is, how exactly does this uncreation coming from God break through the time-space format, the framework, the time-space continuum, retain its uncreatedness, and then come in to be with the creature, in the creature, and still be uncreated? That's what has always been left unanswered for me in my readings in the Orthodox literature. Is that kind of what you were saying before?
More or less, yeah. I think there's kind of two sort of central things here, right? So like kind of the two central problems is the vision of like the divine energy sort of breaking forth into creation and acting on creation, right? That's kind of the model of like a created agent acting, right? So like that's like a created agent sort of like acting on a patient in order to change the patient. Thomists, even classical Thomists, John of St. Thomas would effectively say, like, well, we can think of God that way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the way that God actually is. The first idea is that thinking of God as a created agent that acts on patience and whose activities are specified by patience is sort of to misconceive God. And it actually makes God seem further away, because it makes God seem like he has to act at a distance on a patient. Whereas we would rather want to think of creation as being a kind of imminent action, just God not having to act on a distance, because he doesn't act on anything at all. It's just in the process of knowing and loving himself, he sees creation, he sees and he knows and loves creatures. And there's no action at a distance, because creatures are made out of nothing. So there's this whole, one part of the issue is modeling the activity of God in the world on a created actor. That's number one. The second kind of issue is also this one that you brought up, is how can an energy both be uncreated in the proper sense, uncreated in the proper sense, and also be really of the creature, right? And because it seems to me, some solutions will suggest that, like, divine energies are really God, really divinity, but they're pieces of God that come to be and pass away in time.
Right.
And but so something that comes to be and passes away in time and is a real possession of the creature deified, and is a contingent product of God's will, is also uncreated, seems to me to be a contradiction. What's really, from a Thomist perspective on this side, what's really missing is the notion of the distinction between the natural and the supernatural. Being able to talk about something that's supernatural, so that it's not either the divine essence or the creature, so that something can come to be in the creature that's disproportionate to the creature as such, but really capable of elevating him to God. But it's this problem of how can something be of the creature and uncreated? And it seems like it replaces, and then that also kind of obviates the notion of synergy, which, if there's to be a synergy, there has to be two energies, the energy of God and the energy of the creature. But it sounds like a divine energy kind of replaces the energy of the creature in the deified creature.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And like Michael was saying, some of the Palamite interlocutors we've had on the show and outside the show have been left uneasy with some of our explanations coming from a Thomistic point of view, because what they see still being unanswered for them is how is the wall or the chasm that's dividing the creature and God, how does that get closed?
Yeah.
And they want that so closed. They want it to collapse so that the two can really become one.
Sure. And I would just say that one way to do it, I mean, I attempted to do it in my thesis in a bit of a technical way, but is to really grasp, actually to really go back and rethink what creation is. Because the way that a Thomist is going to do this is a Thomist doesn't think of creation as a transient action, right? A Thomist will sort of think of creation, first of all, take seriously that creation is out of nothing, right? So that God is responsible for the entire being of the creature, even at the natural level, and that creation is actually not a transient action that passes from an agent into a patient and is accomplished in the patient, but creation is actually an eternal, immanent action of God, which takes place sort of inside the divine essence, where it's intimately connected with God's actions of knowing and loving. And since the creature is created out of nothing, God's not operating on a patient. So a Thomist just sort of doesn't have the problem of how is this chasm crossed? And it's really because the Thomist has a less anthropomorphic, more apophatic understanding of God, frankly. And that's really kind of where, so like if you really get what like sort of the classical Thomist position on creation is, you wouldn't sort of think of there as being a chasm between a creature, even on the natural level, and God.
Yeah, and there was another book that I had read a while ago. I never got a chance to finish it. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's by A.N. Williams or Wilson.
Yes.
Williams. It's The Ground of Union,
Yeah.
Deification and Aquinas. And the author there, I think, brought out a good point. And I also integrated this with some of the writings of Jacques Maritain on how the human being and God come together in an intercommunication, and that takes place when something has to link up that's similar in God and in man. And obviously we have an intellect and a will, we have our rationality. So that aspect right there is what the sanctifying grace element works in order to boost up, so that we can actually have that divine communication with God. So rather than seeing intellect and will as something so firmly planted in the creation, so infinitely away from God, the intellect and the will, the rationality of the human being, is actually communicating with the divine on that level through the infusion of the theological virtues. So
Absolutely.
there is a closing of the gap, you could say, per se, not in the sense that now creation and creature lose their distinctives, but that something similar in God, namely intellect and will, and in the human being, intellect and will, actually can come in an ineffable way, can come in that divine intimacy. And it kind of follows the divine missions paradigm that Aquinas has in his Summa Theologiae.
What? Oh, sorry, Michael. Were you going to intervene or? Oh, okay, sure. One thing that I was thinking of, and something that I've suspected sometimes, at least in the discussions of some neo-Palamites, something I was thinking of is that they're just coming back to this idea of creation. Sometimes I think that there's an approach to creation and nature that's sort of in underlying. There's a concept of creation and nature that kind of comes more from modern philosophy, where nature is a sort of like mathematical thing. It's this sort of inertial thing that sort of exists in relative independence from God. And they sort of think of nature in this maybe almost in a sort of Newtonian sort of way. And then the problem becomes, well, like, how do you make God intimate to this nature? Even before you think about grace or the supernatural thing, how do you make God intimate to this nature? And they're thinking of nature and where nature's come from, maybe in a more early modern sort of way. And then the sort of Orthodox Neo-Palamite proposes as a solution, well, what happens is God reaches out to creatures to energize them, right? And then God becomes radically participable through the diffusion of his energies into this sort of world of nature. Sometimes I wonder if that's not the operative picture. That's sort of the problem that gets set up, that sort of neo-Palamism is meant to solve, is that concept of nature. Whereas maybe the real solution is to go back and think about maybe a more pre-modern concept of nature and what it means to be the creator of such a nature. Then it seems to me that then the problem isn't God having to diffuse himself to make himself participable by creatures, but just the fact that creatures, even on their natural level, are there. Sometimes you'll hear certain Eastern theologians talk about things like, a symptom of this is sometimes you'll hear certain Eastern theologians use phrases like the deification of the material creation. Now, I haven't been able to find a phrase like that actually in the Greek fathers, but it seems to me that it's not significant speech. What does it mean for a tree to be deified, for instance? And what does a deified tree look like as opposed to a non-deified tree? Well, I don't know. What it seems to be like what they want to say is that somehow God is more involved in the world through the diffusion of his energies, and they're using the concept of energies and deification to do that. You can tell the difference between a deified man and a non-deified man because one of them behaves in a godly way. They exude the uncreated light in some sort of sense, right? But it just seems to me that like maybe one of the issues that Palamites are trying to do is solve a characteristically modern problem by reapplying in a creative way older categories from Eastern Orthodox theology. Whereas a Thomist is much more likely to say, oh, we just have to get past all these early modern concepts of nature and nature's autonomy from God, and go back to a more a traditional understanding of creation and teleological natures.
Yeah, good. That's interesting. Yeah, I concur with you about digging in the Eastern Fathers for some of the material deification. I mean, you do see some of the divergence between, for example, Augustine on the theophanies, for example, when he talks about the creation, sort of created effects which came to produce divine communications, versus what some of the Eastern Fathers were saying. But St. John Chrysostom, in his commentary on the Transfiguration, the Taboric light, he distinguishes that glory from the glory that is to come. So it doesn't seem like he's working with so much of that strict, Palamite reading of that text.
This has been sort of a question since Gregory Akindanos challenged Gregory Palamas himself. Gregory Akindanos challenged Palamas as a reader of the Fathers, and his constant complaint wasn't against hesychasm, it wasn't against deification. He was absolutely not a Barlamite, even though sometimes in order to sort of like kind of trash his reputation, people assimilate him to being a Barlamite. He was absolutely not. One of the things he was questioning was Palamas himself's reading of the Fathers of the Church, saying that you need to give the Fathers a much more integral reading than Palamas was doing. So even from the time of Palamas, Greek Fathers themselves have questioned Palamite readings of things. And it's something that modern sort of pro-Palamite historians haven't quite reckoned with. John Meyendorff, who did groundbreaking work in editing the works of Palamas and interpreting him, nevertheless just sort of dismisses Akindanos and says, oh, well, you don't need to even read his arguments. He's just a hidebound conservative, too obsessed with what texts actually say, and they just sort of dismiss that whole line of argument. But it seems to me that there has to be a real reckoning, like Greek Fathers may admit of a Palamite reading, they may not, but do they require one?
Right, yeah, good point. Mike,
yeah,
you there?
Yeah, it's freezing up a little bit on me. Are y'all able to hear me?
I don't know if Michael can Michael hear Mike? Okay.
I can hear you now. It's catching up.
I can keep going if you want, but I didn't want to hog the whole show.
No,
Okay.
you're fine. If you had some more,
I can go on and on.
Not a problem. If you have some more,
I could ask more. Just I didn't want to hog the show.
No problem.
Okay. Father, can you hear me and Mike coming through all right?
You're breaking up a little bit. All right, now I can't hear you.
Yeah, okay, I can't either.
My question, how about now?
You're good now.
Okay, no, I my last question was just, what did you find in your attempt to answer the whole issue of like freedom in God and the act of creation?
Yeah, so I'm still trying to work on that a little better. I'm not wholly satisfied with my answer, but the relevant kind of thing to see is to see that the whole idea is that creation is not an object that specifies God's act of knowing and willing in the way that determines an action. So for Thomists, right, acts are specified by their objects and what they sort of aim at, right? And kind of the answer to the question is that because of the way creation works, it's not creatures that are objects of the divine willing. What are objects of the divine willing is the divine essence itself. So what does God love primarily? What does God know primarily himself? What does he love primarily himself? Those are the adequate objects of his intellect and will, in as much as we distinguish intellect and will in God, of course, because simplicity, those have to be the adequate objects of them. So God's act of willing and knowing is specified prior to, with an ontological priority, but prior to his creation of creatures. And it's actually his activities and knowing and loving which sort of lay the groundwork for creatures. Because when God knows and loves, what he knows and loves is when God knows and loves, what he knows and loves is his essence perfectly in all the ways that it's imitable. And sort of in the process of knowing and loving his essence so perfectly, he knows and loves the good creatures that come from it. This is a bit mysterious how it happens, but to answer the simple question of seeing why, if God created a different world, he wouldn't be different, is because his acts of intellect and will would still be the same because they're still specified by the same object, the divine essence. It sounds, some people don't like it when you say, what does God know and love? Well, he knows and loves himself. But what that is, it sounds very ego, right? Right? God's just sort of in love with himself.
Right.
But like what it actually means though is, there's actually profound implications. It's actually profoundly pastoral. Like when you just see like God's just been thinking for all eternity about you and the way that you specifically, imitate his goodness and the way he loves you because he loves you as a unique and unimitable imitation of his goodness. Being able to talk to people about like, you're useless. That's the good news, right? God doesn't have any purpose in loving you. He just knows and loves himself and sees exactly why you're beautiful, right? And sees exactly why you're the sort of person he'd want to be. It's powerful to tell people that pastorally. So it's not a bad doctrine. It's a mysterious answer, but it kind of works better than the Palamite one, because ultimately, if you want to specify a contingent creation on the Palamite understanding, then you have to posit a contingent plurality of energies, right? So for a Palamite, why did God create this world and not another one? Well, it's because he has the energies that he has. Well, if the world is contingent, then that means the reason why God has these energies is contingent. And so now you've just pushed the problem back like, well, you just push the problem back another level to where now you have to explain how God got a contingent plurality of energies within the divinity rather than a contingent plurality of creatures. So it doesn't really solve the problem. It just pushes the problem back into the divinity. So it doesn't work. The real nub that both Thomists and Palamists are both trying to solve is sort of the fundamental problem of Christian metaphysics, right? So the fundamental problem of, say, maybe metaphysics in general is the problem of the one and the many. Like, how does, from a principle of like a singular principle of being, there arise many beings?
Yeah, that explains some of the rise of the Neoplatonic philosophers. They're
right.
Trying to,
and the Neoplatonic solution is actually very tempting. Because for the Neoplatonists, they just say, well, it's just because this is the plurality that the one gives rise to. There is no contingency, right? It tempted someone like Erick Pearl, who sees Gregory Palamas as the capstone of Neoplatonism. but then he thinks that God's energies are necessary, the ones he has are necessary, and he stopped being a Christian. The problem of Christian metaphysics is not just how do you derive a plurality from the one, but how do you derive a contingent plurality from the one? The fact that the plurality is contingent, of course, implies that whatever the one is, it has to be knowing and willing. It has to be personal in some sense. But the great mystery for Christians then is how does a contingent plurality arise from a single metaphysical principle? Like, how does that work exactly?
Yeah, you mentioned Dr. Erick Pearl. I've not gotten a chance to read the book Theophany, but it's on my shelf. It's waiting for me.
Sure. He has a good paper on the metaphysics of Palamas, but like once you read the paper, but if you read the paper, it's very well done philosophically. Like the philosophy is very well done. It's obviously from a Neoplatonic perspective, but once you read the paper, you kind of read the paper and you realize, oh my goodness, this guy actually doesn't think that God is a personal principle, and he thinks that creation is a necessary emanation from God. He has to think that, and he thinks that that's what Palamism ultimately implies. Some of the work of what David Bradshaw is trying to do in his book, particularly towards the end of his book, is he's actually trying to fight against that. Right? He's actually trying to show a type of Palamism that sort of preserves the personal nature of God and the personal nature of God's act of creation, sort of over against Erick Pearl's interpretation.
Father, I have some questions for you from the chat, if you don't mind.
Sure.
This one's from CS. He asks, can you briefly explain how the Thomistic school is split into different directions, and where do you fit in on this? Do you follow Lagrange's school of thought? Where do you land on that?
Oh gosh, so that's a complicated question. What's the history of Thomism? I'm just gonna say like that's too much to answer now. I should say that my confreres Romanus Cesario and Cajetan Cuddy have written a nice little book on the history of Thomism, and they'll be able to kind of tell you a little bit about it.
Okay.
But like kind of where I fall, my general proclivities tend to be with the strict observance school of Thomism. So I read a lot the traditional Thomistic commentators, and so someone like Garrigou Lagrange is kind of right up my alley. However, I think in my own personal view of Thomas, I'm willing to admit more Platonic elements. Like my interpretation is a little more, I would say, Platonic than they do, or at least I would pay a little more attention to Platonic elements of Thomas's thought than say an old-fashioned strict observance Thomist would. So I'd say that someone to me that would be an influence is Cornelio Fabro, although I'm not exactly him, but I think he's the most interesting Thomist of the 20th century.
Okay.
Or at least the one I think is the most interesting. But I do love Garrigou, and I do love the 16th century commentators.
There's another question. Is the Western intellect intended to be a corollary to the Eastern nous? If not, how did St. Thomas completely miss this aspect of human anthropology?
So I would say that Thomas in the intellect, right? So Thomas distinguishes functions of the intellect, right? And so there's an act of the intellect which is called intellectus, because it's sort of like the fundamental act of the intellect, which it gets translated as understanding, and what that is reason's grasp of the first principles of reasoning, sort of like the basic ideas. It's where we grasp our kind of like intuitive ideas, and that would be a kind of Thomistic analog to the Greek idea of nous, I think.
This one is from J2 Nick. He asks, what are your main objections towards Eastern Orthodoxy?
I love Eastern. I actually love Eastern Orthodoxy. like I said, I love Eastern spirituality. I love the Eastern liturgy. It's kind of how this project fell into my lap in the first place. I would say in terms of ecumenical dialogue, I'll kind of three levels. First, in terms of ecumenical dialogue, the only ecumenical issue that matters is the papacy and maybe some related related kind of church state issues and some related ecclesiological issues. But the issues surrounding the papacy are real. The Orthodox do have legitimate concerns about the Catholic interpretation of the papacy, right? I mean, if I were Eastern Orthodox, I would be scared of the Pope too. I can definitely see why someone from that perspective would be scared of the papal claims. But I think ecumenically, that's the only dispute that matters. I think sometimes from the Orthodox side, other disputes get kicked up that need not matter or don't matter, and sometimes because they're based on unfortunate misunderstandings of Western positions or sort of oversimplifications. I don't want to say willful, but sometimes it seems willful. Of issues like the filioque or the issues like the filioque or issues like the divine energies, right? Coming to a more adequate understanding of those, I think, is a difficulty. The third, sometimes, and this would be an issue of sort of like modern Eastern Orthodox theology. Sometimes I think that modern Eastern Orthodox theology sometimes claims to be going back to the Greek fathers, but isn't really going back to the Greek fathers, but is actually really indulging in some of the trends of, say, more modern theology. And really, in terms of Orthodox theology, I would love to see like Orthodox theology and more kind of, frankly, scholastic Catholic theologians sort of make common cause against modern things. But sometimes I think under the guise of the ancient faith, some Eastern Orthodox theologians stumble into ideas that are effectively kind of modernism. And it's kind of like an ongoing trend. It's almost like there was that guy in My Big Fat Greek Wedding who says, take any word, and I will show you how it is Greek, and they almost kind of say like, take any idea, any trend in modern theology, and I will show you how it is really Greek. And I think that needs to be challenged a little bit. But I mean, Eastern Orthodoxy, it's such a beautiful and powerful tradition. I mean, I don't know how you could go to, pick any Eastern Orthodox liturgy that you like and not fall in love with it.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. And so, just kind of curious, side question here, following up on that. Would you say that there really is any reasonable resolution or solution to the Eastern Orthodox ecclesiologies versus Vatican I's ecclesiology? Is there really any way, or is just somebody going to have to, say I was wrong?
The Holy Spirit has a way. I would say this. I would say this is my amateur opinion. It's kind of outside of an area. These are I'm kind of spitballing here.
No problem. Yeah.
I would say one thing that could happen from the Catholic side is sort of kind of clarifying some of those claims from Vatican I, right? So it turns out that like these, but for lack of a better word, let's say grandiose papal, I accept them, right? I'm an Orthodox Catholic. I teach at a pontifical college. Right. I accept them.
Right.
But for lack of a better term, grandiose papal claims. One, I think, way that would help to point them out is to point them out in a way that they're helpful to Orthodox. They were never really made against other bishops or patriarchs, whether those are Western Catholic or Eastern Orthodox patriarchs. What they really are papal claims made against the encroachments of the state. In the 19th century, the church is dealing with this new situation where they're really dealing with encroachments of secular, anti-clerical, or non-confessional states. And they're really trying to maintain the integrity of the church's interior life in the face of secular authorities that will try to confront it. In fact, if you look throughout history, like every time the Pope makes a more grandiose claim about his authority, it's really much more about maintaining the integrity of the internal life of the church against encroachments by the state. Mm-hmm. I think that's helpful to point out to try to see that like the papal office is sort of meant to protect the integrity of the life of the church. And I think if Vatican I's dogmatic declarations were sort of developed, thought about in terms of that historical context, it would make it more helpful. Mm-hmm. It also kind of would relieve some of the Orthodox's own difficulties, like a grandiose kind of papacy, or like a primacy with teeth, as they call it, isn't necessarily meant to just bully them. I also think that from the Catholic side, Catholics just need to make very canonically clear that like an Orthodox church is a sui juris church, and they should just be let. You shouldn't be invading their own internal affairs. So like, even though Vatican I sort of concedes or teaches that the Pope has the power, it seems to me that like, just because you have the power doesn't mean that every exercise of that power is prudent. And assuring the East that those exercises of power are imprudent would be helpful. On the other side, from the Orthodox side, I think like one thing that the Orthodox could ask is, has the Orthodox Church been co-opted by the state and by nationalistic forces too often? And is something like a papal office a way of maintaining the integrity of the church's inner life over against inappropriate encroachments by the state?
Okay.
That would be a question. That's how I think
sure.
about it.
Okay. Do you believe that the Scotus school introduces problems with the univocity of ideas, or is it a legitimate position that will eventually be reconciled with Thomism?
Well, I think that they're irreconcilable positions, right? The way that Scotus sort of sets things up is just a different paradigm, right? So I don't think that they're possible to be reconciled. I think that they're just different. And this is kind of what I think we just have to do, is you just have to be comfortable with different philosophical paradigms. Like, I can say that, some other guy is wrong philosophically, and like, he has the wrong philosophical options by which he explains the faith. But when it comes to confessing the articles of faith, he confesses them. That kind of plurality, I don't want to say that like plurality is okay in the sense that like, oh, we're all true in our own way. No, some people are just wrong. And as an old-fashioned Thomist, I would just say, well, no, the Scotus position is just wrong. But so I wouldn't want to have a wishy-washy plurality, but a plurality of philosophical options can exist within a common confession of faith, and not split us up in our confession of faith.
One more. Do you believe the essence energy distinction subconsciously denies God's unknowability, apophaticism, because it makes positive assertions about the essence of God?
That's kind of an interesting argument. I think what a Palamite would deny that it does, because they would say that like, in distinguishing the essence from the energies, we're distinguishing what is unknowable about God, and we're not saying anything about the essence. We're just saying that the energies are different from it. So like like that's the only positive assertion that it's making. Yeah, I think that's about the only thought that I have on that.
I think on the flip side, couldn't one say that, when you make such a distinction, doesn't this mean that you really can't know God because you don't know his essence? Now, of course, I know the answer is,
sure.
The essence is fully in the energies, but if you're making this distinction and we never know the essence, doesn't that kind of lead to agnosticism? How would you respond to that?
Well, so I think, this is where I think that like there's actually kind of interesting dialogue. What the problem that you have to do the problem that you have to try to get at when you think about like the vision of God, like the vision of God that makes you happy in heaven, is that like, God wholly, God, the whole God, but you don't know him wholly. Like, so Thomas says, totum sed non totaliter. You know the whole of God, but you don't know him wholly or totally. And it's really complicated how to explain that. Right. And that's what Thomists and Palamists are both trying to do in their own way. One way I like to think about the energies, right, is that they're like a kind of window on the essence. Like they're kind of like each individual creature's take on the divine essence, so to speak, or the point of view from which each creature views the divine essence. So I mean, I think that would be clear that what you're experiencing is God, but like what they're trying to do is just preserve the fact that God is ever greater. So like in heaven, I know God, but I don't know God. Like I know the whole of God, but I don't know all of what that means. And it's hard to say. It's part, and this is just part of divine simplicity, is that like we know we can say things that are true about God with our language, but like there's a very real sense in which we don't know what we're talking about, even though we can form true propositions.
True. I think that's it for chat questions, but Father, I number one want to thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate you so much. And then I also want to invite you to come back on again. If you're available, feel free to say no. But
absolutely, yeah.
If you're available, I'd love to have you on. I think you would be an excellent individual to represent the Thomist perspective if perhaps we end up having a roundtable discussion with the Scotus and the Palamite. So I'd love to have you on. But, you know, we'll talk about that off the air, see if we can coordinate that.
I'll have to brush up on my Scotism.
Yeah. Well, hey, you know, we can see how far we can get. To my knowledge, I don't think that a Thomist and a Scotus and a Palamite have ever really gotten together in a video discussion.
And joke about it.
You know, I was about to say a Thomist, a Scotus, and a Palamite walk into a bar. It sounds like a great, sounds like a joke. They walk into a video discussion, you know. Definitely sounds like a joke, but yeah, we'll definitely talk more about that. But even if that doesn't pan out, I'd love to have you on again.
Great.
This was excellent. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for the pleasure.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we'll be in touch more off the air. Erick, thank you so much for coming on as well.
Oh, no, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so everybody, please comment, like, subscribe, share this material, and God bless you all. Until next time, go share your faith.
All right, we'll see you later.